Chapter 3 of The Man with the Red Beard by David Whitelaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 3 The Shot in the Fog. I paid the man, and without a glance to see whether my friend with the red beard was still on duty, ran up the flight of stairs to the room on the first floor. The theatres were just out, and the big square room was rapidly filling. I crossed to a table near the window, and, taking my seat, ordered a whisky and soda. I really felt that I had earned one. If the careless revellers around me had known what I knew, the proprietor could not let those windows at coronation prices. On the opposite corner stood the Barbarians' Club, and I wondered how the uniformed man at the door would acquit himself in a quarter of an hour's time. Of the red-bearded man I could see nothing. Doubtless he was still near, but beyond my range of vision. I noticed the window of the room in which, perhaps, Paul Bergstoff was still writing. What must be the thoughts of that man, calmly preparing to smooth the path of the girl he loved, knowing that within half an hour he must be dead, or on the road to a long term of imprisonment? I named the man as a hero, and I felt a flush of pride that fate had singled me out to be the ally of such a one. The roadway was congested with traffic, mainly motors taking parties home from the theatres. I could see the sheen of diamonds and the warm richness of wraps in the lighted interiors of the cars as they were held up by the policemen on duty at the corner. At last the car I was watching for rolled slowly up the slight incline of Whitcomb Street, coming to a standstill a few yards beyond the club entrance. I could just recognize in the little monkey-like figure in his furs huddled in the corner of the tonneau my Russian friend of Park Lane. With him were 3 others. I watched while these men left the car and walked to the door of the club, where 2 of them remained, whilst the third accosted the policeman who was attending to the traffic. The man in uniform nodded and looked towards the barbarians. The clock over by the bar in the room I was sitting in pointed at 5 minutes to the hour, and, hastily swallowing my whisky and soda, I went out into the street. There was no sign of the man with the red beard, but the mass of humanity surging over the pavements made search impossible. I took up a favourable position at the corner, and with collar well up to my ears, waited. A distant clock chimed. At the 6th stroke Paul Bergstoff pushed open the swing doors of the club and stood there on the step buttoning up his coat. The next moment he was surrounded. A man took up a position on either side, and the policeman, who, I saw, had left the roadway, stood near. It was all done so quietly that I doubt whether any one in the crowd around knew that an arrest had been effected. The little party walked to the waiting car, which was immediately started. It shot into the road, backed, and then turned and slid down the hill. As I watched it, thinking of the tragedy of the man who was in it, a figure sped out from the mouth of a little court and, stooping, ran after the car, which had pulled up at the traffic of the crossroads. Although I saw this, the true significance of the proceeding did not occur to me, and it was not until I saw the figure climb on to the back of the vehicle that I understood and ran forward. I was too late. There rang out on the night air the sharp crack of a revolver. The figure dropped from the back of the car. I caught a glimpse of a red beard. Then the man seemed to melt into, and be swallowed up by, the fog. I joined the crowd, which collected around the motor car, but I kept in the background, fearing the chance recognition of Sir Boris Fenberg. The occupants were bending over the form of Paul Bergstoff as he leant back on the cushions. I had sight of a white face and long black hair from beneath which a thin trickle of blood ran down. The eyes were closed, and the sight called to my mind men I had seen on the frozen snow of the streets of Lutsk the January before, and I knew that the ruse of Paul Bergstoff had been in vain, and that for him all was ended. But was it in vain? I asked myself the question as I made my way through the quiet back streets to my chambers in Craven Street, and I answered no. If before I had been attracted to the adventure, I was wedded to it now. The death of the man who had come so strangely into my life had made a deep impression upon me. Indeed, I felt as though I were under a moral obligation to do his wishes. The still face that I had seen lying against the green cushions of the car spoke to me more eloquently than had the same face smiling at me across the little coffee table at the Barbarians' Club, and I swore then and there that I would do what lay in my power for a girl I had never seen, but for the love of whom Paul Bergstoff had laid down his life. I rang up the paper on the telephone when I reached my rooms. I did not think it expedient that I should tell all I knew, but I meant that the Mercury should at least have a fuller account of the affairs at the Barbarians' Club than any of its contemporaries. That much I owed to my journalistic conscience and to my partner. My sleep that night was uneasy and punctuated with many dreams, visions in which the doings of the evening were strangely intermixed with past adventures in the frozen empire of Russia. I woke with the impression that throughout all, the dream face of a woman had looked at me, a woman with white oval face framed in smooth dark hair, and with eyes of deep gray which had gazed at me imploringly. I rose and parted the curtains. There was but little traffic so far on the embankment below me, and a glance at my watch showed me that it was not yet 8 o'clock. The fog had entirely lifted, and the wintry sun was shining timidly on the leafless trees of the gardens. A string of barges was drifting lazily down the river, and from the chimneys over the water smoke rose in thin spirals into the calm air. I wrapped myself in a thick dressing gown and sat and smoked a cigarette and gazed out over the river, thinking of the events which had crowded themselves in the few hours of a November evening. I had left this very room without a care to see if I could run across any of my friends in the Empire, and I had met Bertie Traverson and Paul Bergstoffe. Looking back, it seemed so unreal, so interwoven with my dreams that I found it difficult, at first, to winnow the fact from the fancies. But there amongst the litter I had taken from my pockets when I had undressed, and heaped upon the dressing-table, was the cheque on coats bearing the cramped signature of Sir Boris Fenberg. That, at any rate, was real enough. My cigarette finished, I had my tub, and went into my little sitting-room for breakfast. There was a small heap of correspondence beside my plate, and on top of the pile was a large envelope bearing the imprint of the Barbarians' Club. It was addressed to me in an angular foreign calligraphy, and I turned it over with mixed feelings. This letter written but a few hours ago by one who was now dead. I put this aside until, after breakfast, I could give it my undivided attention, and opened my copy of the Mercury. End of Section 3.